Hi everyone, my name is Brian McElwee. I'm a lecturer in philosophy at the University of Southampton. Most of my teaching and research is in ethics, and that's what I'm going to be talking about in this little video. More specifically, I'm going to be talking about a topic in practical ethics. What moral duties or obligations do we have towards the global poor? I want to begin with some basic facts about severe poverty around the world today. At present, about 3 billion people, that's between a third and a half of the current global population, live in extreme poverty, living on less than $2.50 a day. And about 1 billion of those live in really extreme poverty on less than $1.25 a day. And because of this extreme poverty, many millions of people currently suffer from severe malnutrition and from disease and are unable to meet their most basic needs. As the German moral philosopher Thomas Pogge says, people who are so incredibly poor are extremely vulnerable to even minor changes in natural and social conditions, as well as vulnerable to many forms of exploitation and abuse. Currently, up to 50,000 people die every day as a consequence of severe poverty. As the American philosopher Leif Van says, the average number of deaths from poverty each day is equivalent to 100 jumbo jets, each carrying 500 passengers, most of whom are children, crashing with no survivors. From a human perspective, Van says, severe poverty should be the top story in every newspaper, on every newscast, and every news website, every single day. Now, most of us living in affluent countries give relatively little attention, first of all, to these facts about the world in which we live. Most affluent people like us also do very little by way of providing assistance to people living in this condition. Why? Why do we do so little? Might we not be guilty of a very serious moral wrong by failing to respond to such need, to the suffering of so many innocent people around the world? What appears to make this a moral issue is not just the magnitude of severe poverty around the world, but the fact this coexists with levels of comparatively extreme wealth. So the poorest 3 billion together around the world have about 1% of aggregate global income, whereas the wealthiest 1 billion, of whom most of us are a part, currently have about 80% of aggregate global income. And a redistribution of just 1% of aggregate global income from the wealthiest group to the poorest group, from the wealthiest 1 billion to the poorest 3 billion, would on its own be enough to eradicate severe poverty, at least in bare economic terms. Now, many of you may be thinking, yes, of course, the wealthy should be helping out the poor, but I'm not wealthy. That's what you might be thinking to yourself. Well, in fact, if you come from a UK household that's on the UK average income, then that puts you inside the top 5% of wealthiest people in the world globally. So even though there are many people who are much wealthier than you or me, nonetheless, in global terms, most of us are very well off indeed. Now, why are we not more troubled by the extent of severe poverty around the world, when we're apparently in a position to do something to make a massive difference to some of these people's lives by redistributing some of our wealth to the global poor? Well, perhaps some of the explanation for this lies in what's vivid or salient to us in our everyday lives. We're not persistently, vividly aware of the reality of extreme poverty, what life is like for people living in the conditions that I've mentioned. And our complacent moral values are perhaps reinforced by those around us. They're shared by those around us. We might think, well, no one else around me is devoting their time or resources to addressing severe poverty around the world, so it must be okay, morally speaking, for me likewise to do nothing. Now, that might be an explanation of our inaction, but it certainly doesn't seem to serve as a moral justification, a moral defence for our inaction. So, what sorts of lines of justification do people offer for inaction in the face of severe poverty around the world? I want to focus on 4 lines of thought that we often hear in the media and more generally in public discourse that serve to justify in people's minds inaction over global poverty. These 4 lines of thinking are ones that the German philosopher Thomas Pogge, who I mentioned already, notes, and then he goes on to explain why he thinks these are insufficient justifications. They're not very convincing justifications for inaction in the face of severe poverty around the world. So the first line of thinking is or concerns overpopulation. So we often hear it said that helping the global poor will only lead to a population explosion, leading to an even larger number of people who are in great need. Well, this line of thinking, I think, won't get us terribly far, because all the evidence tells us that birth rates, in fact, tend to fall when poverty is alleviated. We know that reducing poverty as well as empowering women are the 2 best strategies for combating overpopulation. So that line of thinking, that worry about overpopulation, if we do take measures to address extreme poverty, that's not going to get us very far as a justification for our current inaction. A second common thought that we hear in the media is that severe poverty is simply too big a problem. There are far too many people living in severe poverty for us to be able to make a dent, for us as individuals perhaps to address the problem. Well, there's a couple of things we can say in response to that. Firstly, as we've noted already, simply a redistribution of 1% of global income, most of which we, the affluent, control, from ourselves to the poorest 3 billion people around the world, would on its own, in pure economic terms, be sufficient to eradicate severe poverty around the world. The globally wealthy, including us, are so well off compared to the global poor that just a small redistribution, a redistribution of a very small proportion of our wealth to the global poor would be sufficient to eradicate the most severe global poverty. A second thing that we can say in response to this line of thinking is that just reducing global poverty itself would constitute a very significant achievement and something very, very valuable in itself. So it's a mistake to think solely in terms of completely eradicating or ending global poverty. Each individual life that's saved or each individual life that is improved is itself a very valuable achievement. So just think about how much you care about your own life or about the life of one of your loved ones. If you could save your own life or the life of one of your loved ones or improve it dramatically through financial means, then that would itself be something very valuable. It would make all the difference in the world to you and to your loved ones. Well, people living in severe poverty are just as real and just as important. Their lives are just as valuable as your life or the life of one of your loved ones. So if we can save or improve the lives of just one of those people, that in itself constitutes something that's very, very valuable in itself. So it's a bit of a distraction to think exclusively in terms of completely ending or eradicating global poverty. That can distract us from the good that we're able to do if we can help just a small number of people. A third line of thinking that we often hear in public discourse about global poverty is that throwing money at the problem won't do any good. The problems that sustain global poverty are extremely complex, and just giving money won't do anything to address these problems. Well, in this case, I think there's some nuggets of truth in that line of thought, but nonetheless, it's not going to be able to get us off the hook when we're thinking about whether inaction in the face of severe poverty is justified. Here are two responses that we can make to this kind of thinking. So firstly, we should distinguish overseas development aid, official overseas development aid, from effectively used money. So the history of aid from wealthy nations to poor nations has been very mixed indeed. But that doesn't mean that we're not in a position to help people living in poor countries by using those types of aid that we know from the historical record are successful. The overall history of aid isn't really relevant when thinking about what good we can do, either as individuals or as whole nations, in helping the poor, because we have a very good idea of what kinds of aid are in fact successful. And the second response that we can make to this sort of thought is that traditional aid, giving money or food or medicines, isn't the only thing that we can do to address severe poverty and to help people living in severe need around the world. We can also think at a more political level, trying to restructure the global order, change global institutions so that they don't contribute to the persistence of severe poverty around the world. Okay, the fourth and final line of justification that I want to mention is the thought that global poverty is disappearing, it's decreasing, and so we can be relatively relaxed. We don't need to worry too much about our inaction in the face of severe poverty around the world because the problem is going away. Well, it may be true that the overall proportion of people living in extreme poverty around the world is decreasing, but nonetheless, in light of the statistics that I mentioned at the beginning of this little video, nonetheless, it's clear that an extremely urgent moral problem remains. Compare other contexts in which we're considering fatalities that are decreasing. So imagine, for instance, that I was the manager of the local swimming pool and you asked me, Brian, have you ever had any fatalities in your swimming pool? And I said, yes, 25 people died at my swimming pool last year. I think you'd be shocked by that. You'd say, what, 25 people died at your swimming pool? Is that not a really terrible thing that you should be disturbed by? Imagine I responded by saying, oh, don't worry, 30 people died the year before. Now, you wouldn't think of that as an acceptable response. And yet, that is the line of thinking that many people seem to offer when they say that inaction regarding global poverty is okay because the problem is decreasing. So each of these four responses that are common currency in media discussion of severe poverty, it seems to me, don't get us very far. They don't serve to morally justify our inaction in the face of severe poverty. So let's come back to our main question. What are our moral obligations to the global poor? Now, this question has been dominated within moral philosophy over the past 50 years or so by the Australian philosopher Peter Singer, who some of you may have heard of. He wrote a very influential paper about global poverty at the beginning of the 1970s called Famine, Affluence and Morality. That's published in a journal called Philosophy and Public Affairs. You can easily find this article by Googling the title, Famine, Affluence and Morality. It's a very readable accessible and thought-provoking little article. So what does Singer do in that article? Well, here he offers a couple of very simple arguments which purport to take us from starting points that most of us would accept to conclusions that seem very disturbing, perhaps extreme. He tries to lead us to the conclusion that most of us, by failing to respond adequately to severe global poverty, are living in a way that's deeply morally wrong. He thinks we're morally obliged to give up most of our luxuries in order to try and help some of those living in severe poverty around the world. Now, one way that Singer does this is by stating a very simple principle which he thinks most of us are initially inclined to accept. That's what he calls the principle of sacrifice. It says, if it's in our power to prevent something very bad from happening, without thereby sacrificing anything else morally significant, then we ought morally to do so. And by ought morally there, he means we're morally obliged to do so. It would be wrong of us not to. And then he argues that this principle, this general moral principle that seems quite intuitive to most people, that is triggered by the current global situation of people living in severe poverty. We are in a position to prevent something very bad from happening to some people living in severe poverty at a very small cost to ourselves. And consequently, we are morally obliged to respond. A second very memorable way that Singer tries to lead us to such a conclusion is by means of an argument from analogy. This is his famous pond analogy, which some of you may have heard of. So imagine that one morning when you're on your way to work or to college or to school, you pass by a shallow pond and there's a small child in this pond who's in danger of drowning. You can step into the pond and lift the child out and save them from the risk of drowning. The only cost to you is that you're going to get your trousers and your shoes muddy. So very, very minimal cost to yourself, you can save this child's life. Now we can ask two questions about this scenario. First of all, we can ask, what would you do in this situation? I think most of us would pretty promptly step into the pond and lift the child out, and we've done a great deed. A second question we can ask is, how would we respond to somebody who failed to do that, who just walked on by and left the child to drown? I think most people would think that such a person had done something very seriously morally wrong. We'd be quite shocked by their behaviour. Well, Peter Singer argues, the moral relationship that we stand in to the child in danger of drowning in the pond is just the same as, in relevant respects, the moral relationship that each of us stand in to people suffering from severe poverty, who are in danger of death as a consequence of their poverty. When we fail to provide assistance to them, we're doing something that's morally akin to the failure of somebody to save the drowning child in the pond. So he concludes as a consequence, again, that we have a moral obligation to give up our luxuries and to devote the money that we save to helping people living in severe poverty around the world. Now, if Singer's arguments are successful, then morality is a good bit more demanding than most of us previously thought. We are morally required to change our lifestyles in quite a dramatic way. So this is quite a striking conclusion, moral conclusion, that Singer has tried to lead us to from premises that we were initially inclined to accept. So that's a lot of food for thought. I want to end by giving you 3 small tasks in light of what I've been talking about. So firstly, I want you to think about Singer's pond analogy. Can you think of any relevant differences between the moral relationship that we stand in to the child drowning in the pond and people suffering from severe poverty around the world? Can you think of any differences you think are morally relevant between these two scenarios? Are we really doing something as seriously morally wrong by failing to respond to severe poverty as would somebody who just walked on by, leaving the child to drown? If not, then why not? What are the relevant moral differences? That's what I want you to think about. Secondly, Peter Singer thinks that most of us are doing something seriously morally wrong by failing to respond to severe poverty. He thinks we have a sort of moral blind spot, if you like, in failing to realise that we are acting in a way that's seriously morally wrong. So the second thing I want you to do is think for yourself about whether there might be any other aspects of our lifestyles or our behaviour that similarly constitute moral blind spots. Could it be there are other aspects of our lifestyle that mean we're acting in a way that's in fact seriously morally problematic, that we don't do justice to in our ordinary everyday thinking? So you might consider here, for instance, our failure to respond to the climate crisis, or the treatment of animals in the food industry, or perhaps to racism or sexism. Those are the sorts of areas that you might consider. And finally, the third task is that I urge you to have a little look at Peter Singer's website, which is called The Life You Can Save, and that tells you a lot more about the issue of global poverty more generally. Hope you've enjoyed this little video, and I hope it's given you some good food for thought. Thanks very much for listening.